manipulating things and trying to get witnesses to lie and so that they could frame Ken Botham for his wife's murder. And then finally, Deborah Tomlinson was murdered in December of 1975. And so you have all these mysterious murders, and they're all being attributed to lone nut serial killers or the husband did it. But what it really seems like all of these murders are part of a consistent pattern. According to one website that I found about the Ken Botham case, all of these victims were involved in drugs. All of these victims were, sexually involved with the police officers, which was another weird thing. Linda Miracle's boyfriend was a cop in Grand Junction named Truman Haley, and other women similarly had, police officers that they were sexually involved with. And it turns out that the police chief himself would actually be partying with some of these victims. Now how does that sort of thing happen? Why would the police chief be at parties with these women who are involved in drugs and prostitution?
It's the same exact thing in Long Island killer, who is still unidentified,
Right. So it seems like, this is a situation where these women are getting basically being abused by people in power, and then when they try to speak out about it, they just end up murdered, and then they just attribute them to serial killers or innocent scapegoats like Ken Botham.
Wasn't the first lawyer that Bundy took murdered with a motorcycle accident?
Yeah, well, that sort of thing happens a lot in other cases too. I think, wasn't Charles Manson one of the first lawyers that he had pretty much died soon after he took on the case? So that sort of thing is really common too.
Yeah.
What defense lawyers essentially being silenced. And anyway, so the police chief of Grand Junction, Ben Myers, it turns out that Ken Botham's investigators were looking into the chief, Ben Myers, and they found that he had large deposits in two of his bank accounts, and they tried to get a court order to subpoena them, but the court denied it. And then immediately after they got this court order, Ben Myers just resigned as police chief. He cleared all of his bank accounts, and then he went to take his job in Aspen, Colorado instead. So it seems like, Ben Myers was, definitely involved in all sorts of shady dealings with drugs and prostitution there, and as soon as they were about to catch him, he just fled, got rid of all the evidence, and then he turns up presiding over the Bundy investigation in Aspen, and then this witness picks him out as the perpetrator in the murder of Karen Campbell. That to me just seems like too big of a coincidence to, not be significant. It seems like Ben Myers was definitely involved in all of this corruption there.
Well, I think that's an astute observation for all the information I just heard, yeah.
And also, there was actually, there was a podcast, a while ago, a couple years ago, there was a podcast called Junction, which was trying to look into these murders. Unfortunately, the podcast ended after only 3 episodes because I guess the person who was doing it ran out of funds or whatever. But in the very first episode, he interviewed 2 people who talked to Pat Botham a week before she was murdered. And Pat Botham said that she and Linda Miracle were going to come forward with some news that was going to shock the whole town. So it certainly seemed like there was, a big revelation that was about to come out, and then all of a sudden they just get murdered a week later. Seems pretty likely to me that they were, silenced because they were about to reveal something really significant.
Incredible stuff.
Yeah, and that was actually just something that I found out only today, about a couple hours before we had this call. I was looking into this case a bit more, and I found the podcast and listened to the episodes. They're still online, actually. But yeah, I do think that, Ted Bundy was essentially, if he was involved in these murders, he was, this was a contract hit that he was essentially taking up to get rid of these women. But I think it's even more likely that he wasn't involved in the in like the Denise Oliverson murder, for example, and he just took the rap for it because they needed to close the case.
Yeah, correct.
And
I also have my suspicion if he is responsible for the Cal Omega murders.
yeah, I really don't. I think it's highly unlikely that he was. Like, I remember that originally one of the witnesses said that the killer looked like the sorority houseboy, like didn't look like Ted Bundy.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that Ted Bundy was probably not involved with that, and also like the fact that the semen that they found came from the semen like had no blood type information. It came from a non-secretor, but Ted Bundy was a proven secretor.
Yep.
So that makes it pretty unlikely that he was, the source of that. Which is another piece of exculpatory evidence. And actually, like, in that article, that People magazine article that I shared with you, like, the jurors pretty much totally disregarded that testimony about how Ted Bundy was a non-secretor. Like, they didn't understand it at all. They just didn't care. They were like, oh, I felt that Ted Bundy was guilty, and they just totally ignored the secretor evidence, which makes me a lot, worried that, the whole point of a jury is to, make sure that the prosecution actually proved its case. But it seems like they just, stacked the jury with people who were going to believe anything they heard and not question things.
Yeah, didn't the jury and also trial watchers acknowledge the fact that Ted Bundy was probably not fairly prosecuted?
I know that, like, what's interesting is that, I know that Karen Campbell's brother, who was in Florida, was following the case, and even though, you would think that he would have a vested interest in having Bundy be convicted because he's supposedly the one who murdered his sister, but he himself was pretty much, saying that he was skeptical of whether the bite marks were real. Like, he didn't think that a lot of the testimony was actually convincing in the case. And I actually read something of, like, in recent years, like, a lot of the forensics that have been used to convict these serial killers has pretty much been acknowledged officially in the mainstream media that this forensics is, not very well substantiated, or it's being manipulated by FBI investigators who are just trying to get a positive result to help the prosecution, even when there's no basis for it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't remember, have you done a video on Bobby Joe Long yet?
No, I only read the chapter on Dave McGowan's book. He brings very good information in that case. That whole case has the terrible stench of a cover-up.
Right, and I, like, back in May, like a couple months ago, I was trying to find out all the names of the law enforcement officers who were involved in the Bobby Joe Long case.
Oh, nice.
And I found that the FBI fiber examiner who was involved in the case was later forced to resign because he had been, lying about evidence and overstating all these fiber matches. So, you have someone who has now been officially acknowledged to be, a liar who is falsifying evidence, and yet Bobby Joe Long is still in prison, still convicted primarily on the basis of this fiber evidence.
Yeah, it's when you've done your homework, it's truly unbelievable the facts that come up.
Yeah, and the other thing that I sort of wonder about regarding Ted Bundy is, there was a story a couple years ago about how they were going to put his DNA into, like, sort of a cold case, like, investigative file and see if his DNA would match DNA from unsolved homicides. But the thing that I was wondering is, why don't they take his DNA and compare it with the DNA from the cases that he was already convicted of? Right?
Yeah.
Why don't you make sure that these convictions are actually solid? And I think they don't want to do that because they're worried about what they might find. They think that they're they're probably going to exonerate him or find that he wasn't the only perpetrator, and that would once again blow up this whole mythos, and people are really going to start to question if what we think we know about serial killers is even accurate.
Yeah, I think after McGowan's book, people really should have done their job much better than it is portrayed in the media. But yeah, it's just one single theory, just one lone nut, the lone serial killer, the lone wolf, and there's no bigger group involved in any kind of drug connection or satanic connection,
Yeah,
pedophilia
and I
connection.
think, and I think that's sort of like that's by design. Like part of the reason is I think, all of these. When you look at all these assassinations of JFK or Martin Luther King or JFK's brother Robert Kennedy, and all these things that are obviously politically motivated assassinations, and then every time they just say no, it was a lone nut. There's nothing significant behind this. Lee Harvey Oswald did it all by himself. James Earl Ray did it all by himself. Sirhan did it all by himself. There's no greater conspiracy. And I think that people are skeptical. People were skeptical of this, so they sort of had to introduce the concept of serial killers to make it seem more plausible that these lone nuts would just commit these random crimes on their own. And even if you would think that there was some greater motive behind it, they're like, no, it's just a lone nut who's crazy. And I think that's part of the reason serial killers are kind of a propaganda effort to change the way that we think about violent crime overall. And so we always assume that it's only one person. We're sort of indoctrinated with the idea, two people would never get involved with each other to commit these crimes because they're driven by their own demons and they can only understand each other. But that's, obviously ludicrous. There are all these drug rings or sex rings, all these different criminal organizations, and for whatever reason, it's, people just assume that it's a serial killer instead of assuming, maybe it's a larger group that commits crimes in the same manner. Like for example, the Atlanta child murders are a big example of that. Because that the Atlanta child murders were almost certainly, there was a large pedophile ring in Atlanta that was involved with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, there's pretty abundant evidence of that. A lot of the victims were directly associated with these pedophiles. Sometimes there were even witnesses who said that these pedophiles were the ones who murdered them. But the FBI rolls into town, and the FBI immediately sends in its famous profilers, and the profilers just say, oh, there's just one black serial killer who's behind all the murders, which makes absolutely no sense. There's clearly this large underground ring that's behind them all. So I think that the whole, serial killers have been introduced to rewrite the way that we analyze crime and get us to, dissuade us from even considering the whole conspiracy angle, even though that's more often than not, that is what's really happened.
Yeah, that's my same suspicion, I think, and an excellent choice of words. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So,
What do
yeah,
you think? Have you investigated whatever Ted Bundy was ever sexually abused? Because I saw on Oxygen a new show about the Ted Bundy case where his defense attorney made revelations, and he said that Bundy stated to him that he was playing some sex game in the woods with a 12-year-old boy, and that was his first murder victim.
no, I haven't heard anything about Bundy being, sexually abused, but it wouldn't surprise me. It seems like almost all of these killers are, have this prior history of sexual abuse, even when it's I know that with Jeffrey Dahmer, you've been doing some great work in that regard, trying to find out, what is the truth behind his alleged sexual abuse, because his father said that, it was a neighborhood boy, but there are other indications that maybe it was actually Lionel himself who was perpetrating the abuse. So, I mean, I don't know anything more about Bundy being sexually abused. I do plan to look into that now that you've brought it up, but it certainly would fit into everything else that we know about serial killers and their life histories.
There's also another book. I think it's called Confessions of a Felon Hook. I have to see again what the proper title is. But it's made statements that Ted Bundy was also possibly a homosexual. So that's also pretty interesting. And I also had some YouTube comments that stated that fact from personal experience. They said that they knew Ted Bundy, or an aunt of them knew them, and told them stories. And maybe, what was it? No, I forgot what my point was. But it was pretty interesting. Pretty interesting if it really indeed was, if that's the case.
Yeah, I'll have to look at that. So also about, like, I guess one last thing about Bundy before moving on to other things that I brought up there is, it turns out that, like, one of the, there was a girl in Washington State who her parents thought for decades had been murdered by Ted Bundy, and then DNA ultimately showed that it was another person who committed the crime named William Cosden. So I think, it's already sort of confirming that a lot, like, we assume that it's just Bundy all on his own, but it's now sort of being officially confirmed that maybe this Bundy mythos is not quite as accurate as we were originally sold it was.
Yeah, correct. I think independent researchers will come with other possibilities, but the old chronicles, the authors will always maintain it was Ted Bundy alone. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, and certainly, like, there are definitely, the mainstream media is not that great at, not the first place I'd go to get, a true sense of how the world operates. But I do think that
Same here.
every so often the mainstream media, releases little sort of snippets at a time of the truth. Like, every article, has a little tiny bit of truth embedded within it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you have to take all of these take all these bits, put them all together, and then you can start to form an accurate picture of how things operate. Like, the mainstream media will give you the pieces of the puzzle, but they'll never put it together for you.
Yeah.
And researchers like Dave McGowan, for example, they were the experts at getting all these pieces and then putting them together. And so every so often you see a story that, like, sort of casts a bit of doubt on whether Ted Bundy was actually the killer, but if these stories are being released, sporadically over a long period of time, and unless you take the effort to collect them all together and then look at them, you might miss it. And that's how this sort of mythos gets maintained, even when it should be, I would argue, discredited at this point.
Totally agree. Yeah, I would make the same argument about Dave McGowan. He was truly a master in picking the right pieces of mainstream media, which actually show some kind of conspiracy behind it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, I guess we've said quite a lot about Ted Bundy, but there are, like, definitely other killers that I've been looking at. So is there anything else that you want me to talk about, like the links between multiple serial killers, the John Huey case, Charles Manson, or
Maybe about Hillside Strangler and Rodney Alcala.
Yeah, sure. So, and once again, this came directly from Dave McGowan. I don't know if you saw this, but in his Laurel Canyon book, the epilogue is actually about Rodney Alcala.
Oh, I have to read that immediately. Oh, I'm gonna read that tonight.
Yeah, there's some very weird stuff in the whole case, like...
I only got the PDF file from Laurel Canyon, so I just wasn't starting at the beginning.